All right, today we're going to talk about the U.S. attempt to control Central America through what historians have called the Dirty Wars, and we'll also talk about the debt crisis that Latin America faces starting in the 1980s. So this lecture is largely based in the 1980s and will, in some countries, move into the 1990s also. So first off is the so-called Dirty Wars. Uh, we're going to do this in a few countries that in Central America that the U.S. had a lot of influence over or tried to retain a lot of influence over. So first one we'll talk about is Nicaragua. The United States had supported a dictatorship in Nicaragua under the Somoza family going back to the 1930s, and that had been in place all the way through the 1970s when a new guerrilla movement started to fight against the government and eventually won that civil war in Nicaragua in July 1979. So the Sandinista revolutionaries toppled the U.S. supported Somoza dictatorship and took over the country and started running democratic elections. And the U.S. government at this point is fairly accepting of this. This is the U.S. President Jimmy Carter, who had wanted to run U.S. foreign policy based on humanitarianism and stopping support for these vicious dictatorships that previous U.S. leaders had supported completely. So when the Carter administration started to pull its support for the Somozas starting in 1977, that's what gave the Sandinistas its giant opportunity to win the Civil War. So U.S. President Jimmy Carter is not really so much worried that the Sandinistas have won the Civil War because the Sandinistas appear mostly their goal is to help poor people and hold democratic elections. So the Carter administration is not so much worried that the Sandinistas are like full communist and they want to form alliances with the Soviet Union or win the Cold War for the Soviets or something like that. But conservatives in the United States were outraged that Carter had allowed this to happen. They basically argue that Carter handed over a Latin American country to a communist group, which they accused the Sandinistas of being, and that from that point forward, if the U.S. didn't get more active in trying to stop communist revolutions in Latin America, that communist groups, one after another, would topple Latin American governments and take over, and communism would eventually take over all of Latin America and use that to win the worldwide Cold War. So U.S. conservatives are using the domino theory again to justify their foreign policy demands. And this was a major point of argument in the U.S. elections in 1980 between Carter going for a re-election and his challenger, Ronald Reagan. And eventually the conservatives under Reagan win that debate and they win the presidency. And so they will go into office in January 1981, and they will quickly impose a trade embargo against Nicaragua to try to strangle the Nicaraguan economy, to do damage to the Sandinista government. And the Reagan administration, we now know, will very quickly start sending the CIA into Nicaragua to train anti-Sandinista revolutionaries and give them weapons and money and whatnot that are often led by the former dictatorship's officers. So the U.S. is building up a revolutionary force to overthrow the Sandinista government starting in 1981, and this force becomes known as the Contras. That's what they're called in the United States, at least. So the Contras relied on secret funding from foreign sources, mostly funneled through the CIA. And this is all completely secret from the American population. The American population know that the Contras are there and that they're going to start fighting a civil war against the Sandinistas. But it is kept top secret that the CIA is giving most of the weapons and money and whatnot, and even a lot of training to the Contras. And when that is revealed in 1986, going into 1987, that is a great threat to Reagan. There's talk of impeaching Reagan at that point, and some of his military leaders and CIA operatives went to jail for basically breaking U.S. law. They were taking money illegally and distributing it illegally. So some of them went to jail for a few years. But getting back to Nicaragua itself, the Contra attacks completely failed to overthrow the Sandinista government. The government is fairly popular amongst the Nicaraguan people. So this Contra revolutionary movement is a kind of radical, kind of conservative, anti-communist movement that the general population does not agree with very much. But the Contra attacks did bankrupt the Sandinista government to a large extent. The government had to pay up to 50% of its yearly budget just for its own self-defense to fight off these revolutionaries. And that did a lot of economic damage to the country, along with the U.S. trade embargo, and caused a very large amount of inflation. So this civil war is fought in Nicaragua throughout the 1980s. Until really 1990, there's more national elections that one of the candidates named Violeta Barrios de Chamorro won because she was the widow of a journalist who had reported on this stuff and who had been assassinated. So Chamorro ran for office trying to end this civil war, which had killed thousands upon thousands of Nicaraguans and had really devastated the country. So she ran for office in 90 as a fairly inexperienced politician who ran on a platform of ending the Civil War and figuring out some kind of peace treaty to get the fighting to stop and get the country somewhat back to normal. So Chamorro offered unconditional amnesty to soldiers on both sides. She offered ending the military draft, which was the idea was very popular because most people hated the draft. And that generally got a treaty that started on the path to ending the Civil War. Another Contra group would rise up and start another guerrilla war against the Sandinistas later in the 90s. But Chamorro got a treaty with them also to try to tamp down on the fighting. So there is still some sporadic fighting by the time her term of office ends in 96. And the next president, who was elected in 96, finally got the last treaty that ended the last of the Contra Wars. And that treaty included financial compensation to people who had had their land confiscated in the 80s, reformed the Constitution to allow both sides in the Civil War to build up political parties and run in national elections. So the fighting is fairly sporadic going into the 1990s, but it still exists, and that final peace treaty to end the Civil War once and for all is signed in early 2000. And now moving on to El Salvador. We see very similar types of dynamics in El Salvador. The Salvadoran government was a brutal dictatorship that the United States had supported for decades, going into the 1970s. President Carter, who went into office in 1977, constantly complained about the brutality of the Salvadoran dictatorship and pulled a lot of support for it. But there is no giant revolutionary movement yet in El Salvador that can take down the government. So it's really the U.S. stopping its financial support to the dictatorship, but the dictatorship stays in office. And then Reagan entered office in 1981 and obviously stopped those complaints about the dictatorship, ramped up the funding for the dictatorship again, and under the general argument that the United States has to support Latin American dictatorships to keep communists out in order to win the general civil war. So the United States in the 1980s will use El Salvador especially as a place to experiment with destroying insurgencies and revolutionary movements. So the U.S. government will send kind of CIA operatives and military leaders into El Salvador and train the Salvadoran army in how to monitor the population, how to target potential troublemakers, and how to arrest them and torture them and do all kinds of things to keep the population under control. And this is, many historians argue that this is a big shift in U.S. foreign policy. Instead of directly trying to send in kind of U.S. military personnel to repress a country or a population. They instead choose to send in kind of military advisors into a country and train that country's leaders in how to maintain control over its population without allowing elections or anything like that. So basically training dictators in how to stay in office. So this becomes kind of like a new school of the Americas based in El Salvador, and they're basically hiring the local government to implement the violence to destroy any communists or any other possible troublemakers. And some historians call this the, quote, El Salvador option, where the U.S. is testing out its counterinsurgency tactics, especially after the failure of a lot of those tactics in Vietnam in the 60s and 70s. And some historians argue that the U.S. government in the 1980s wants to use Central America as a kind of workshop type area to experiment with imperial strategies and counterinsurgency tactics and repressive tactics. And they specifically used Central America to do that because Central America was so unimportant to the Cold War and was realized to be so by both the United States and the Soviet Union. So that the United States said, let's find an unimportant place that the Soviets don't really care about, and we'll test out our repressive tactics there, because it won't piss off the Soviet Union to the point that risks a worldwide conflict that could lead to nuclear war or something like that. A lot of U.S. leaders on the Democratic Party side and the liberal side and the general world population understand what's going on in El Salvador, and El Salvador has been a kind of despised government around the world for its brutality for many years by this point. So there's a lot of worldwide opinion that is against the U.S. doing this and against the Salvadoran government doing this, going back many years. So some U.S. politicians demand that the U.S. government stops sending any money or military aid to the Salvadoran government, particularly after a bunch of religious leaders, especially nuns, are murdered in 1980. And these wars, this fighting, will continue in El Salvador through the 1980s until there's a 1992 peace treaty that ends the kind of fighting of this. There's a resistance movement that largely breaks out trying to overthrow the government in the 1980s in response to a lot of this increased repression. So a treaty rises in 1992 to end this ongoing civil war, and the treaty demands that the kind of revolutionary movement create a legitimate political party and give up its kind of revolutionary insurgency in exchange for amnesty against human rights abuses and whatnot. And next country, we'll talk about Guatemala, also in Central America. Guatemala was mired in a horrific dictatorship that had killed over 200,000 of its own people since the 1960s. The Guatemalan government ran what historians call death squads to go out and destroy any source of dissent or a complaint, not just the Communist Party or Communist Party members, but also to go after any group that might be affiliated with communism, like labor unions or kind of peasant farmer groups that want more equality and more higher wages for themselves. And the Guatemalan kind of attack on its own people and repression is also known across the whole world, and there's even worldwide protest and calls on it to stop, and don't have much effect in Guatemala itself because Guatemala is getting so much support from the United States to prop up their government. And this kind of repression only really ends in 1986 when the military dictatorship is so confident it has wiped out all potential communist and any level of political dissent that it actually allowed a civilian election, a fairly free democratic election, to take place in 1986. So political leaders are elected and they'll start Guatemala on the path of ending that repression and ending the full-scale dictatorship. And the next country on our list is Panama. So Carter and Torrijos, the military dictator of Panama, had signed a new canal treaty in 1978. And Torrijos was killed in a helicopter crash. in July 1981, just after the Reagan administration entered office. So there's a lot of suspicion around the world that the Reagan administration had assassinated Torrijos. A new civilian president rose in Torrijos' place in 1981 and ran the country for a year, and he himself resigned a year later in July 1982 to make his own vice president into the new president. So there's a lot of changing of Panamanian leadership from the time that Torrijos is assassinated, or at least died in a crash. Many historians argue that at this point the National Guard, which is basically the Panamanian military, were taking control over the country with the promotion of this new president in July 1982, that they had control over that politician in order to get their guy, the leader of the military intelligence service, which is basically like the U.S. CIA. The leader of the intelligence service is really the one running the country from July 1982 forward. And his name is Manuel Noriega. Noriega is often assumed to be the one that's running the country throughout the 1980s, even though he's never the official president. He's kind of the military leader that's behind the scenes, that is making the big decisions and telling the president what to do and getting certain laws passed through Congress and whatnot. So Noriega is increasingly throughout Panama recognized as the informal leader of the country. So he does some very important things. He refused to allow the School of the Americas to operate in Panama, which is something that Torrijos had accused of being a horrible thing earlier in the 70s. And that angered the United States at the same time as it really made a lot of Panamanians and other Latin Americans very happy. Noriega also largely refused the U.S. demand to renegotiate the 1978 treaty that would give the canal back to Panama. So that also angered the United States. And Noriega, some historians argue, continued to negotiate building a new canal with Japanese firms, just like Torrijos had wanted to do in the 1970s. But Noriega stays in power and keeps his puppets in power in the Panamanian government through mass repression, election fraud, intimidation of opponents. He has anyone who criticizes him arrested, sometimes tortured or even murdered. So he is an increasingly repressive and autocratic figure in Panama throughout the decade. The United States accused Noriega of having contact with drug traffickers and accused him of money laundering, even brought court cases against Noriega, even though Noriega would never go to the United States because he knew he'd be arrested under such charges. There are coup attempts against the Panamanian government in 1988 and 1989 that we still today don't know exactly where they came from or what, if any foreign power supported them, but Noriega stopped those coup attempts and stayed in power. There is also supposed to be a Panamanian free democratic presidential election in December 1989 that many Panamanians hoped that some pro-democratic politicians would win and they would start to undo this dictatorship under Noriega. And then Noriega delayed the elections, and that seemed to be kind of the last straw for the United States. The United States then invaded Panama with 20,000 U.S. troops in December 1989, charging Noriega with money laundering and drug trafficking and repression and all these things. It took a few weeks to find him in the country and arrest him, and he was eventually brought back to Miami and put on trial for drug trafficking and basically spent the rest of his life in prison. But this is an outright invasion from the United States. It's one of the first very clear interventions, military interventions from the United States into Central American country with outright U.S. troops, and many of them, 20,000 of them, in several decades. So this seems to be a big turning point for U.S. foreign policy in a lot of ways. The U.S. government officially estimates the death toll in this invasion of 500 or 600 Panamanians, but international human rights groups often estimate it to be much larger than that, up to perhaps 5,000 deaths and the destruction of homes and residences that made 25,000 more Panamanians homeless within the month. So there's a big discrepancy between the death toll and the amount of destruction that the United States told the world that it had officially documented, and what human rights groups that observed a lot of this themselves documented. So once Noriega is kicked out of office by this U.S. invasion, the United States installed a new Panamanian president, and that president would stay in power for a while. But the big result is that the invasion completely destroyed the Panamanian economy. So over the next couple of years, the Panamanian economy shrinks by a fifth. So over 20% economic destruction within 2 years of the invasion. So the invasion was brutal, it was violent, and it was extremely destructive, and really tanked the Panamanian economy for many years afterward. So that's a kind of history of U.S., what historians have generally called the U.S. dirty wars in Central America, funding coups, funding revolutionary movements, overthrowing governments, in order to ensure that those governments follow orders from the United States one way or the other, and had a massive effect on the population in Central America, and continues to have a major economic effect even today, where we see a lot of major groups from Central America trying to leave these countries and start moving north, either to move into Mexico or even go all the way further to go live in the United States. And another big thing about the 1980s for Latin America is what historians have called the debt crisis. The debt crisis starts in Mexico. So Mexico had a presidential election in July 1982. One of the kind of high-level politicians who had been in the cabinet for several administrations, named Miguel de la Madrid, won that election and would go into the presidency. He would be inaugurated in December 1982. But in between those two times, the debt crisis in Mexico starts. And it's largely caused by several factors. First, there's an oil price collapse on the worldwide markets in 1982, which the Mexican government had been depending on high oil prices so that the government could mine and sell its oil reserves on the worldwide market to raise cash, to raise revenue. And when the price goes down in 1982, that really hurts those plans. Another is that Mexico has borrowed huge amounts of money since World War II, largely from the United States or the IMF or other big banks, to fund a lot of its infrastructure projects, its roads, schools, universities, hospitals, bridges, its basic kind of industrialization. So Mexico had a massive amount of foreign debt that it owned, kind of national debt as we would call it in the United States. And in mid-1982, the Mexican government started running out of U.S. dollars to pay those foreign debts and pay the interest on those foreign debts. So the Mexican government, before Madrid isn't even inaugurated, starts making public statements that it's running out of money to make its monthly debt payments plus interest. And that causes a lot of alarm throughout the world. U.S. banks and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, rushed to put together a rescue package for Mexico, because those entities realized that if Mexico doesn't get new loans or some kind of bailout or something, that if Mexico goes into a debt collapse and cannot pay its foreign debts, that Western banks and governments and other organizations had loaned so much money to Mexico and other Latin American countries throughout the whole region since the 1940s, that if this unravels in Mexico, that unraveling can quickly spread to other Latin American countries and could start a worldwide depression. So the IMF puts together especially a massive rescue package, really, with its old demands, though, which is basically austerity, budget cuts. So the IMF offered a huge amount of money to Mexico to try to stabilize the situation, but demanded that the Mexican government would have to cut its government subsidies to the Mexican population to buy food, to buy just general household utilities like electricity or natural gas, water, The Mexican government would have to stop borrowing money to pay its yearly bills, which means it would have to cut its yearly national budget to balance revenue with spending. And that Mexico would generally have to accept what we call neoliberalism, which is balanced budgets, cuts to any subsidies to companies or private people, individuals, end of import taxes, tariffs, get rid of those. And the general argument is that neoliberalism will force private companies to become more independent and more efficient and therefore more competitive so they can make more money and hire more workers. So the general neoliberal argument is that individual people and companies should not be dependent on their governments giving them subsidies or the government's paying for big social programs or something like that, especially if the government has to borrow money continually on a yearly basis to do so. So the government accepted this offer, and that will launch Mexico into a general recession throughout the rest of the decade, throughout the entire 1980s. So Mexican worker wages eventually be cut in half by the end of the decade. Living standards therefore collapse because the Mexican workers are making half as much money as they used to, and oil prices will continue to fall, which harms government revenues. When Madrid goes into office in December of 1982, his big solution becomes to a lot of this is neoliberalism, which he'll ramp up even further. He'll go beyond just cutting tariffs and cutting the government budget, but he wants to privatize all these state-owned companies, or at least a whole lot of them. And privatization generally means that the government will take like an electricity company that it owns and will basically say the government doesn't want to run this anymore, so they put it up for sale. So there's really a massive international auction. Whoever shows up and makes the highest bid will buy this company. Some governments do this every once in a while, hoping to raise as much money immediately, just get a big influx of cash from the sale, and also eliminate the government need to fund the company through government revenue. So many governments see this as a kind of win-win for themselves. They avoid the responsibility and they get a bunch of money right up front. The problem, though, is when a government puts a whole lot of its companies up for sale at the same time, they basically flood the market. And if you flood the market with any kind of product or any service or anything, the price will go down because there's a lot of options out there to buy. And that's generally what happens in Mexico. They put up a whole bunch of companies, state-owned companies or state-supported companies up for auction within a couple years, generally about the same time. And so they gain less money per company from the sale than they probably would have if they had sparsed out those sales for a longer period of time. But that's often what neoliberals like to do. They like to privatize things as fast as possible, and privatization just means taking a government entity and selling it to a private company, so it'll become a private corporation. One thing to realize, though, about Mexico is that this is a complete reversal of Mexico's government's long-term basic policies about how the government operates and how it runs the economy, going back to at least the 1940s and probably back to the 1930s. So this is a complete reversal of government policy that starts under Madrid in the 1980s. Madrid also wants to gather together Central American leaders to start talking about how they're going to help each other economically and cooperate with each other economically and even politically. So he starts what comes to be known as the Contadora Group, which will include several of the countries kind of highlighted here on this map: Colombia, Panama, Venezuela, Mexico itself as the kind of originator of the idea. And the idea is to start to unite these Latin American economies together and get more political cooperation. And this idea will grow into a larger kind of idea as other Latin American countries start to join it, and we'll start talking about using this group as a means of promoting democracy and peace and justice and equality and economic cooperation amongst these countries, and to get rid of dictatorship and oppression. So this becomes a growing idea from 83 to 86 throughout Latin America. The U.S. government opposed this idea, many historians argue, largely because the United States in the 1980s is very supportive of dictatorships because they think they need dictatorships to keep communists out of office to win the Cold War. So the U.S. administration is completely opposed to any recognition of this Contadora group, and especially when the group starts to talk about formally recognizing the Sandinistas as the official government of Nicaragua and bringing Nicaragua possibly into the group as well. So the United States pressured several countries that it still had control over, like El Salvador, Costa Rica, Honduras, in order to try to torpedo the deal, which it eventually accomplished by 1986. The deal is largely abandoned. But Mexicans, even to this day, still feel a great amount of pride just that they had attempted this, and it gained so much traction, so much popular support, not just among the political class that runs these Latin American governments, but also among the general Latin American population in many of these countries. So moving on to the next area, which is how did this debt crisis that starts in Mexico in 1982 affect the rest of the region, even going into the 1990s? So governments throughout the region will basically have a choice. How are they going to deal with this debt crisis, especially the ones where the debt crisis really has a big effect on them? It doesn't really destroy the economies of all countries. There's a few economies that generally avoid it, like especially Cuba. But this debt crisis will affect a huge amount of countries because a lot of them have borrowed a lot of money over many decades from the United States or international banks or the IMF or someone like that. So Mexico's debt crisis that starts around August or so of 1982 will affect virtually all other Latin American countries. So it snowballs into a general Latin American problem. And the crisis will cause different levels of economic and political crisis in a bunch of different countries we'll talk about for the rest of today. So it will cause a full-scale economic collapse in countries like Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia. And it will cause more governmental level collapse in countries like Peru, Bolivia, Venezuela. So the countries on the left, under economic collapse, they'll deal with economic problems and massive or really large economic problems that destabilizes their economies, but their governments generally kind of survive it. They try to figure out some solutions to it to cope with it. So you don't have a full-scale political kind of uprising or political kind of wholesale changes to the political system in the countries on the left, but you will get those major political governing system changes in the countries on the right. So we'll go through them one after another, but one thing to recognize is that despite which path you go down and which countries you start talking about, they generally came up with the same solutions, which is extremely interesting and something that historians are starting to study in great depth right now. And the solution is neoliberalism. The countries who retain their very similar governments on the left, they go to neoliberalism in order to cut budgets, to cut tariffs, which are taxes on imports, to privatize their state-owned companies, and to generally deregulate their economies. And the countries on the right who undergo massive government changes, the new political leaders often come to the exact same types of solutions for the economic disaster. So it's very interesting that many of the biggest, most powerful countries in Latin America, they may go down different paths, but they arrive at the same set of policy ideas as solutions. So we'll start going through them kind of one by one. I'll talk about Argentina first. Argentina was under a dictatorship in the early 1980s before the debt crisis started. That dictatorship was already in crisis because it had started a war against Britain over what Britain calls the Falkland Islands, which are in the circle kind of down on the far right, which are kind of to the far southeast coastline just off of Argentina itself. So Britain still claimed those islands as a British colony, as British property. the Argentine dictatorship did not like that. They want to take those islands back and reclaim them. So there's a war between Argentina and Britain that lasts several weeks in 1982 that Britain wins fairly easily, and that is completely humiliating to the Argentine dictatorship. So there's a lot of public outcry against the dictatorship at that point, and they are already starting to make moves to leave office and start holding elections again. So when the debt crisis broke out, kind of later in 1982, that's just one more thing that will push the dictatorship into kind of full-scale collapse and start leading toward more democratization of the country. So when the debt crisis starts, just like Mexico, the Argentine government cannot really afford to pay its debt payments by early 1983. So they bring in the IMF, which, same old story that we've seen before. The IMF demands austerity, which means budget cuts, in order to get the emergency bailout loans to save the Argentine economy. So the Argentine government has to balance its budget, which means it has to freeze wages for a lot of its employees and generally throughout much of the society. And inflation also gets going, so inflation goes up beyond 100%. So the money is kind of value is in collapse, and it takes more and more money to buy food and shelter and other goods and whatnot. So there's a horrible problem for Argentine workers in the 1980s. They have high inflation at the exact time that their wages are being frozen. So prices are going up, but their monthly pay is exactly the same and will stay the same for quite a long time through generally the rest of the 1980s. So that starts food riots. It starts all kinds of giant problems in Argentina by the late 1980s. New president is elected in 1989 under this new democracy that got going in the early to mid 80s. And this new president decides that he is going to implement basically neoliberalism as the economic solution. So he will auction off national telephone companies, airline companies, and will, in his first year in office in 1990, and in the early 90s, will start privatizing, again, auctioning off the government electricity, coal, natural gas, subways, and shipping companies, so import-export companies as well. So he's going one industry after another and selling them off to private investors. And he demanded balanced budgets. He created an even exchange rate with the US dollar. He does all these kind of economic things. And his economic policies start a big recession that goes into the 1990s, but also ends at the same time the massive inflation that was destroying the country. And that's something that neoliberals often argue. You have to implement these policies, which will be basically short-term pain of a major recession for the long-term benefit of ending inflation, or at least getting inflation under control. So these policies largely destroyed the middle class. Half the middle class fell into poverty by 1994 or so. And the IMF and international bankers said, well, that's just the cost you have to pay to stop the inflation and get it under control. And Menem also supported a new free trade agreement among several major Latin American countries that became known as Mercosur. And it's basically an agreement to get rid of all tariffs, get rid of all taxes on imports. And it's an agreement amongst Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. So it starts off as a kind of Eastern South America type of free trade group that has the goal of trying to eventually evolve into like basically an EU, a common South American market, like the European Union, where they will generally eliminate economic boundaries between their countries. So they will unite their economies together with the goal of eventually possibly even uniting together under one political entity like the EU has planned to do for decades by now, but still hasn't done. The political unity movement kind of gets slowed down between an argument over who should really lead this political entity, who should have the dominant voice, Argentina or Brazil, and they are long-term rivals anyway. But they start trying to link their economies together in the early 90s, and that idea will grow. Argentina will see more economic growth after the mid-1990s, so going later into Menem's term. Inflation goes way down to like 1% a year. The Argentine economy starts to grow about 5% per year in the mid-90s. So his first few years in office were pretty miserable because they're implementing the neoliberal system that destroys the economy generally and causes a lot of pain for the first few years. But afterward, there's this kind of transition point where economic growth starts. And that's largely what the neoliberals had predicted, that their policies would start a recession for 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 years, but after that, there will be a reversal. So that was largely their prediction. And so neoliberals start proclaiming great success in the late 1990s in Argentina. Next country is Brazil. So Brazil was also just ending its dictatorship and starting to hold democratic elections when the debt crisis started in Mexico in 1982. The debt crisis is a massive problem for Brazil because Brazil had the highest foreign debt of any Latin American country and possibly in the whole world. So tens of billions of dollars. And by the end of 1982 had to suspend its monthly debt payments. So again, the emergency has sounded that it cannot afford to make those monthly payments anymore, and that brought the IMF in again to another country to offer emergency bailout loans to try to stabilize their economy. And of course, they demand austerity. They demand budget cuts and cuts in imports and cuts in tariffs and all these other things, a general economic plan. And the new politicians that are elected to run Brazil in the early 80s, they start putting through a price freeze and wage freeze on wages, so neither wages nor prices will go up. So that worked for a little while, but then inflation starts again by the late 1980s. And successive presidents will try to take neoliberalism even further by going for full-scale privatization of state-owned companies, deregulation of the economy, removal of all tariffs from the country, all taxes on imports should be gone. So the presidents can get elected on these kind of promises saying that this is going to work eventually. But they try to get Congress to pass the laws, and Congress will continually reject those neoliberal demands straight through about the mid-1990s or so. So that's where generally Brazil will be. They're in kind of they start off with neoliberalism, they take the first steps of it in the early 80s, but by the mid-80s to mid-90s, they will kind of slow down on their neoliberal so-called reforms because Congress just starts refusing to pass it. And Congress is largely also responding to popular complaint about many of those proposals. So now going on to Chile. Chile was also under a dictatorship that had risen up in 1973 that had overthrown Allende. So the Pinochet dictatorship is still in power when the debt crisis starts in 1982. And the debt crisis just completely eradicates the Chilean economy. 33% unemployment within a year by 1983. The economy shrank by 10% in just 1 year, so that's just economic catastrophe. The dictatorship, the government started cutting social services, so they started cutting funding for road upkeep in schools and all kinds of things, which outraged the population. Started passing laws limiting wage growth for the Chilean workers, which a lot of Chileans see as basically an attempt to keep them in poverty. But we need to remember that the Chilean government had already started neoliberalism in the 1970s before the debt crisis even hit. So it was probably the most neoliberal economy in all of Latin America before the debt crisis even started in '82. So a lot of this was already fairly unpopular before the debt crisis, and again, the Pinochet government can only stay in power through mass repression of society, assassination of people who speak out or make themselves out to be kind of opponents of the government. And the Pinochet dictatorship is so brutal and so obvious that even the Reagan administration, who generally supports dictatorships throughout Latin America, they'll start kind of slowly criticizing the Pinochet government by 1985 because it is just so over the top in its violence against its own population. So that anger against Pinochet, just economically and as a result of just being angry at being oppressed, pushes Pinochet out of office. There's a popular referendum, a popular vote in 1988 that calls on the end of the dictatorship and to start having new democratic elections again. So that national vote happens in '88. They will start their new democratic elections in '89, and Pinochet will be forced out of office in '90. The elections happen every 4 years. So in 1993, another president is elected, Eduardo Frei, who was the son of a past president. And his general economic policies are to attack inflation and to get more economic growth, and they're often kind of neoliberal type policies. The problem for Chile is that he does get economic growth of around 6 or 7% per year, which is pretty impressive given what's happening in the rest of Latin America by the early 90s. So that growth rate is actually one of the highest rates in the world at that point, and he didn't have to undergo inflation at the same time, so he's seen as an economic success. But much of the growth went to the wealthy upper class. People are already rich anyway, so a lot of the poor are still angry because they still feel very much stuck in poverty. So Chile will build one of the most unequal societies, the biggest gaps between rich and poor by the mid-1990s of any country in Latin America. Frei wanted to get Chile into the North American Free Trade Agreement, which was another neoliberal project started in the United States, Canada, and Mexico in the late 80s, early 90s. So those countries are already passing their own kind of economic unity, get rid of tariffs type deal, so that goods and services can freely flow across borders without paying taxes, just for crossing the border, import taxes. Frei tried to get Chile involved in that to connect the Chilean government to Mexico and the United States and Canada, but the United States Congress refused to do that, to include Chile. So Frei instead pushed Chile toward Mercosur, which means that Chile will try to ally and connect its economy closer to Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And Chile will be just one of the other South American countries that will be interested in doing this in the 1980s and 90s. So you see on this map, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia will also become very interested in joining together as a kind of free trade zone, an elimination of cross-border taxes amongst most of the Latin American or South American countries. And that will take us to talk about Colombia quickly. Colombia, its politics still followed the political deal of sharing power amongst the major political parties that they had signed in 1957. So the government had not really borrowed as much money in Colombia as the other big governments who had borrowed major amounts of money from international bankers like Mexico, Argentina. So the Colombian government doesn't have a giant national debt, but its individual businesses had. And so when the debt crisis hits, these businesses have to pay off these giant loans that they have taken on. And in order to do that, they start laying off workers. So you get a mass unemployment crisis in Colombia. And so the government will, again, go to the IMF for bailout help. So the IMF comes back with the same kind of offer. We'll give you the bailout if you implement austerity, budget cuts. and cuts to employee salaries, people who work for the government, which means teachers, lawyers, bureaucrats, those types of things. Cuts to housing projects for the poor. Cuts even to its own currency, to devalue its own currency. So the government accepts that deal, and that deal goes forward through 1986. Some politicians that were against this deal sweep into office in the 1986 elections because the population became so angry at the office holders who ran for re-election in 1986. They largely get wiped out because the population is pissed off at all these salary cuts and budget cuts and education cuts and all these other things, because it had a real effect on them in their daily lives. But the so-called liberals who win office in 1986, they go into office and they continue on the path of this neoliberal project by cutting tariffs through the late 1980s. So they continue cutting taxes on imports. And so that's how a lot of Latin American countries, just a quick list, try to deal with the economic catastrophe in the 1980s. But those countries kept a fairly stable government system. The big one that we saw change was really in Chile, and it's not so much directly attributable to the economic problems, but just because the dictatorship was so repressive that the people eventually just voted out when they're allowed to vote. So now going to the other side, the governments who do go through massive changes in the 1980s as a direct result of this debt crisis and the economic problems that follow. So Peru had a giant problem with the debt crisis. Peru had already gotten involved in neoliberalism by 1982 because it was under a military dictatorship. So those military dictators had already started cutting tariffs and budget cuts and all those kinds of things. But once the debt crisis started in 1982, the Peruvian economy still shrinks. It still takes a big hit by 10% within 1 year. So the sitting government is fairly popular, and remember that Peru transitions back toward democracy starting in about 1980, so they're going to have democratic elections. A leftist candidate, the APRA candidate, Garcia, won the 1985 elections and immediately starts putting his economic plans into effect. So he is he's against neoliberalism. He wants to cut taxes, especially on the poor. He wants to increase wages, especially for the poor. So most neoliberals want to kind of limit wage growth for average workers. Garcia wants to reduce interest rates, especially for the poor. He wants to freeze prices, which means government control over prices in the economy, which most neoliberals really hate because they hate any government intervention in the economy. He does devalue the currency. He also defaulted on Peru's foreign debts. So he said Peru will be one of the few countries that will refuse the IMF bailout and will instead choose to default on its foreign loans. So a lot of Garcia's policies for his term in office, starting in 85, are fairly successful for the first couple years. He freezes prices and increases wages. So a lot of Peruvian workers are making more money, so they buy more stuff. They can buy more houses because there's reduced interest rates. But inflation is also going to become a problem because there's so much more spending of money and because the government defaults on its loans. So the economy booms kind of quickly for the first couple of years, but then goes into a collapse phase. Foreign investors do not want to put money into building factories or anything, building up businesses in Peru, because they're worried that with the price freeze that they're not going to make much money there. So when the foreign investment stops, that means there's not much new employment. There's not many job opportunities. And in fact, a lot of companies start shutting down in the late 80s because these foreign investors don't want to be in Peru anymore, so they start moving their money elsewhere. And that starts up a lot of union strikes and that sometimes turn violent and starts grinding the economy down to a halt. So you start getting increasing unemployment, growing inflation in the late 80s, and the economy starts to shrink by about 10% per year in the late 80s. So Garcia and the leftist kind of economic ideas are feeling humiliated in the late 80s. And that allows an opportunity for a new politician to rise who was pretty unknown. He was a professional economist who was not really aligned with any political party. He was not a long-term politician in the country. So he decides to run for president in 1990 and actually wins because he says, I am not a lifetime politician. He says, I'm not even a politician. I'm an economist. So I know how to fix the economic mess without getting involved in these kind of party rivalries. So he comes in and he basically says, I haven't been part of this screwed up system for years and years. I'm independent. Send me in there and I'll fix the mess. And the Peruvian voters do. They vote him into office. And once he goes into office as this economist, he starts launching this massive neoliberal transformation of the country. So he cuts tariffs, which are, again, taxes on imports. He starts trying to attract more foreign investment again to build up the Peruvian industry, get more factories and businesses going so that they'll hire more workers and get the economy going again. A lot of those foreign investors hate the fact that there's such powerful organized labor groups and unions in Peru. So this politician, Alberto Fujimori, goes after unions and starts reducing their union rights and the rights of organized labor throughout the whole country. He also restarts making payments on the foreign debts, so he reverses Garcia's policy of just allowing it to go to default. And he takes a lot of other things, does a lot of other things to try to not just get economic growth going, but try to limit inflation. And he has family ties with Japan, and Japan in the 1980s is like the economic dynamo. It's growing faster economically than virtually any other country in the world, Japan and China really. So he says that Peru should have more economic connections to East Asia, particularly Japan and China, because that's a source of economic growth in the world at that point. So he generally puts Peru back on an economic growth path through these neoliberal policies, but they anger different parts of society, especially the union movement, organized labor. Fujimori's great problem, though, is that he does not like people criticizing him. So he refuses to accept dissent or criticism from other parties, and that criticism starts fairly soon. And he just gets frustrated with it, and eventually he just shuts down Congress in 1992, so 2 years into his term. He suspended the Constitution, reorganized the court system to be more favorable to him and his policies, and basically started to rely on the military to stay in office. So starts up a military dictatorship. There are still elections in Peru. So he's up for re-election in 1992, but he uses a lot of rigged elections and vote counting fraud and things like that to stay in office and to keep his allies in office. But APRA's policies under Garcia had been pretty much seen as a disaster for Peru by the late 1980s, so it destroyed APRA's credibility so much to the point that the main possible opposition party to Fujimori, as he goes for re-election in 95, is pretty much humiliated. He has destroyed, for the most part, the organized labor movement. Fujimori also kind of is able to tamp down on these guerrilla movements that are going in Peru and arrest a lot of this revolutionary group called the Shining Path that had been launching kind of terrorist attacks in Peru since the early 80s. So Fujimori does have a lot of support for people who point to the economic growth, the stabilization, and his ability to destroy the guerrilla movement. So he is reelected and seems to be fairly popular by 95, even though he is taking these anti-democratic measures. So a lot of economic elites, big investor class, they like him a lot because he's a attacking unions and getting the economy going again. And he'll run into problems politically later in the 90s that will eventually force him out of office and end the dictatorship in 2000. Next country to talk about is Bolivia and the big government changes it undergoes, especially in the 90s. We need to remember that Bolivia was under a military dictatorship in the 1970s under Banzer. So they had elections in 1977 and 1979 where the population voted for the opposition party, the kind of party that was opposed to the military dictatorship's party. And so the military dictatorship just annulled those elections and stayed in office, so that angered a giant proportion of the Bolivian population. The 1982 debt crisis that got started caused a collapse in world tin prices, which that is one of Bolivia's giant export sources, one of the big parts of its economy. So that largely destroys the Bolivian economy all by itself and starts off hyperinflation of the currency, 60,000%, which is almost unheard of anywhere in world history. By 1983, that caused the sitting president to resign and start calling for earlier democratic elections. So another president is elected and serves out the rest of that term, and the next big elections are scheduled for 1985. And that's when a longtime politician in Bolivia, Victor Paz Estenssoro, runs for election as president yet again and won in 1985. He used to be a very leftist type politician in the 1950s and 60s, but the debt crisis pushed him to change his economic outlook, and he becomes much more moderate and even neoliberal in a lot of ways. And he forms a political alliance with the former dictator, the military general Banzer. So they form a kind of alliance, kind of Estenssoro's moderate party and Banzer's much more conservative party, and they win those elections and they start pushing for a whole new economic plan that is basically neoliberalism for Bolivia. So their policies that they're going to enact starting in 85 are budget cuts for the government, austerity. The Bolivian government had kept price controls over many kind of public services and different parts of the economy. So after 85, Estenssoro ends those price controls and allows individual companies, even government-owned companies, to set their own prices wherever they want. Estenssoro was able to increase the efficiency of collecting taxes. So even as they're cutting budgets, the government revenue starts to grow because they're collecting taxes much more efficiently than the government had before. And Estenssoro also completely dismantles and gets rid of the state mining agency. So the state company that was controlling a lot of the mining, especially copper and tin mining in Bolivia. And generally started free trade, which is the removal of tariffs. So free trade generally means ending taxes on imports so that goods and services, people and products can move across national borders freely without paying taxes, just to go across the border. This angered a lot of people, especially the miners who had worked for that government company and are now unemployed or are getting paid lower wages because now they work for a private company. The next two presidents after Estenssoro serves his term and ends in 1989. So we have another election in 89, and then 4 years later again in 93. The presidents elected in those elections largely follow these neoliberal privatizations and whatnot, follow the general neoliberal policy. So there's another national election in 97, and the former general and former president under the dictatorship, Banzer, comes back and runs for office at that point. He declares himself to be a full supporter of democracy in 97, and he wins the election, goes into office, and continues the privatization of the government companies. And even public resources, like electricity generating plants and things like this. The most famous and the most controversial was when he sold the water supply for the big city, Cochabamba. sold it to a private company that's based in the United States. So once that company won the auction to be basically run the water company for the big city, immediately that U.S. company tripled the water bills for the residents of that city. And that starts off a giant resistance movement, a huge amount of popular protest in the city against the privatization of their formerly kind of municipal city-based water system. And those demands will eventually, in the early 2000s, get that contract with that U.S. company canceled, and will force Benzer to resign from office. He says he's doing that because of bad health, but a lot of historians kind of question that. So there's a mass popular movement against their own elected leaders as a direct result of these privatizations, and this becomes one of the giant protest movements against neoliberalism, not just in Latin America, but throughout the whole world, largely because it worked. It forced the company to cancel the contract and go back to the former system. Another country to talk about that has a major effect on its politics through the debt crisis is Venezuela. So Venezuela is still being run under the Punto Fijo deal that was struck in 1958 between the major parties to cooperate and not attack each other and all these kinds of things, and that they'll share power. So going into the early 1980s, Venezuela was one of the most stable and prosperous and most desirable places to live in Latin America, not just for investors, but also for just average workers. Their wages are high, they're fairly happy. And the debt crisis caused a lot of problems for Venezuela. The government has to restructure a lot of its national debt in order to survive the debt crisis, but generally Venezuela doesn't take a huge economic hit until later in the 80s. And especially after a new president is elected in 89 or 88, and he goes into office in 89. So he comes back. He was president, had served a term in the 70s. His name is Carlos Andrés Perez. And by the late 80s, he completely believes in neoliberalism. So once he goes into office, he starts selling off state-owned companies. So he goes into this privatization drive. He removes tariffs, tax on imports, starts going toward more free trade, and generally starts deregulating the economy, which means that the government will release its control over prices and subsidies and all kinds of things throughout the entire economy, and allow private companies to really run the economy, set their own prices and wages. And very quickly, that deregulation led to an increase in gasoline prices. And when private companies start buying up, especially the public transportation system, they start raising the fees to ride on the buses and trains and whatnot, which causes massive amount of complaints in spring 1989 against this president and the things that he has been doing. People start rioting, especially in the big capital city, Caracas, in 1989, largely against these increases in prices and especially public transportation fees. So Perez decides that he has to send in the military to stop these, what he says are riots, but often largely look more like protest movements. So the Venezuelan military goes in and destroys this protest movement. Worldwide estimates are that the death toll in this fighting is probably around 2,000 Venezuelans are killed in what becomes known as the Caracazo, the riots in Caracas. And so the government's popularity is falling quickly according to its neoliberal drive and its privatization drive. And at this point, just a couple years later, there is an attempted coup by some lower level military officers who are angry at that repression and angry at what the government is doing, basically arguing that the government is only serving the rich. And that first coup is led by a colonel in the army named Hugo Chavez. So he tried to overthrow the Venezuelan government in February 1992 through a military coup, and that failed. And he's basically put in jail for this attempt. There's actually another coup after that later in the year, in November 92, that also failed. So the president survived, but is later impeached on embezzlement charges. So there's a lot of growing accusations of corruption and amongst the Punto Fijo parties, and therefore that level of corruption kind of sucks up all the prosperity in the country for themselves and leaves a lot of the average workers stuck in poverty. So there's a lot of growing anger at the Punto Fijo leadership, saying that the political parties are corrupt, they're embezzling from the government treasury. The general peasant workers, the farm workers, organized labor groups in the big cities, so unions, and even the middle classes, the teachers and doctors and lawyers and those type, they're growing increasingly angry at the government and the government leaders because the government leaders are pretty blatantly wealthy. And it's hard to justify politicians making a basic government salary for flaunting the amount of wealth that they had apparently built up. So there is a giant kind of rising national rejection of the Punto Fijo parties and a refusal to vote for them as these national elections continue year after year. And there's also a lot of anger amongst the entire nation that the leftist party in the Punto Fijo deal had signed up and endorsed neoliberalism. So a lot of the population is saying, well, we have these elections and we have these choices among the parties that are involved in the Punto Fijo deal, but even the leftist, the so-called party that's supposed to be on the side of the workers, they're even completely in for neoliberalism, which does a lot of harm to workers in many instances, to the point where a lot of Venezuelans say, we have these elections, but we don't really have any choice between the two major parties anymore. They're basically the same. So as you see these elections continue, the combined vote for the two parties in the elections in 1988 is about 90% of all votes cast. So that's a clear majority. By 1993, just 5 years later, that's cut in half to 45%. So you see how much national frustration there is with the two parties. And then 5 years later, in 1998, the Punto Fijo parties get only 11% of the vote. So their popularity is in full collapse in the 90s. The Punto Fijo leaders, they try to stay in power largely by staying in their offices, even when they win elections. And they refuse to retire, which means that there's no space, there's no room or opportunity for younger politicians to kind of move up in the party system. So a lot of those younger politicians start creating or joining new political parties to run for office because there's no way they can move up in the old parties because everything's completely stagnant. Those positions are taken. And that largely contributes to the shrinkage of the Punto Fijo party's combined vote share through the 90s. As new parties rise and they run in these elections, a lot of Venezuelans start voting for these alternative parties. Another source of anger in the population is that inflation is rising. So by the 1990s, workers' salaries generally are only 1/3 of what they had been worth in the 1970s. So inflation is starting to get out of control, and that inflation pushes a lot of what were middle-class people into poverty. So the poverty rate doubles to be about 60% of the population by the end of the 90s. So there's a lot of economic inequality in Venezuela by the end of the 90s. Perhaps one of the biggest inequality rates in the world. There's a lot of poor people. A majority of the country is poor, and the rich people are very rich. So there's a lot of just popular anger at all this. So a lot of workers turn to kind of black market jobs. They turn to theft. They turn to crime. They turn to kind of generally street hustling type lifestyle instead of their normal middle class jobs where they can make an honest salary and pay their taxes and be much more stable. So a whole lot of Venezuelans are very angry about this, and especially angry at the rich and the political elite, because the rich, they still enjoy their wealth, they still have their big houses and their gated communities and their security forces to make sure that the poor don't kind of get to them and express violent anger against them. So all this is boiling over in the 90s and getting worse in the 90s. And the government then pardoned Chavez from prison after only 2 years. So he is released from prison in 1994, and he starts building a new political party that he calls the Movimiento Quinta Republica, the Fifth Republic movement, which is made into an acronym, the MVR. So Chavez transitions from military revolutionary that wants to overthrow the government violently, and he transitions into a political party leader that will run for office in national elections. And he starts building up a grassroots movement, basically. So he appeals to the poor to vote for his party. He appeals to the middle classes who are being squeezed. And he gets quite a large hearing from them because they agree with a lot of his accusations. He basically says that the economic elite have created an oligarchy which controls the entire national economy for their own enrichment and keeps everyone else in poverty and misery. And he presents himself as a modern-day Simón Bolívar. That's why this picture in this image is so famous, him sitting in front of the big portrait of Bolivar, and Bolivar is kind of looking down on him. Chavez always presents himself as a modern-day Bolivar who is fighting against the economic elite and fighting on the side of the poor people. And he runs for office based on this stuff, saying that he will end corruption, he will alleviate poverty, and he says that there's really no excuse for such an oil-rich country to have so much poverty. He says the only way you can explain that is that the politicians are corrupt. They're selling the oil for large profit for government revenue, but they're embezzling from the government treasury, and they're taking bribes. So Chavez says that he's running for office to stop corruption, to stop bribery, and to stop all this stealing amongst the elite. And he says, put me in office and I'll fix all this stuff. So in the 1998 presidential election, he got 56% of the vote. He is elected president, and he will go into office in 99. And he'll start implementing a lot of these ideas and a lot of the reforms that he had campaigned on. His own campaign manager really admitted that a big chunk of his win in the 98 elections was mostly attributable to the general incompetence of the main parties, the Punto Fijo parties, that they were so incompetent and corrupt that they kind of did themselves in and handed this huge opportunity to anyone like Chavez who could present himself as a person who's on the side of the poor and the repressed, and that he's going to bring massive change to the country. Some historians argue that the nation voted for change, and Chavez presented himself as the image of that change, and so he was elected fairly easily. So we'll talk next time about how Chavez will lead a new era of Latin American politics to try to undo a lot of this neoliberalism that we've been talking about today, and he'll also take up an anti-U.S. stance and try to lead a new era of resistance to U.S. dominance over Latin America. So that'll be next time.